Okay, today, according to our learning plans, we should be on learning plan 7. I don't have it out there yet. I'll put that out there after we finish up today. I'm going to do things a little bit differently today than I've done in the past, in that I'm not going to go through the individual activities with you today, per se. What I'm going to do is talk through the rest of Chapter 5, and then talk through Chapter 6 with you, point out a couple of highlights, and then give you a chance to work on those lab activities. My goal for the weekend is to actually record those individual labs as individual modules. That way, if you get stuck or lost or whatever, that you can go back and look at those individual lab activities then without having to watch the entire lecture or lab type thing or whatever. There should be plenty of lab time today, though, to get to the majority of it. I'm just thinking that if we just talk through and that you work self-paced, then I can answer questions along the way and be able to, hopefully get through a little bit more material without having so many people wait for, everybody to keep up that way. It also gives you a little bit more flexibility as far as being able to review things more slowly or go more quickly through some things that make sense and so on. In addition, in the lab so far, I've included some lab sims. And I sent an email, I hope that you got this. For next week, I will not be here. So I'll not be here next week, and it was scheduled to have your midterm exam. My initial thought beginning of the semester was to be using the simulations in the lab sim to actually test you and test those abilities. I've revised that substantially in that there will not be a midterm per se. It's just going to be additional lab sim work, so the entire sections. So like so far you've done a lot of things in Chapter 1 or Section 1, like 1.2 and so forth. So as you go through these different areas, you should watch the things that you're supposed to be watching, reading the things, and the most important part will be the quiz questions at the end or the exam questions at the end of each section. The simulators will be very important. I'll be watching those as well, but you'll get your points based on getting these other ones done. After reviewing LabSim, I have seen that there's other ones that could be useful and valuable, so I will be pretty much adding those all together as a replacement for your midterm. So let me try to clarify this. I've assigned some lab sims to you. Some people have missed them or not seen them or done a couple of them. So I'm going to list all the lab sims that you should have done from the beginning of time until next week in next week's learning plan. So on learning plan 8, when I put that out there, it's going to have all the lab sims that you should have accomplished, which would be up through Chapter 6 activities. Now, as you go through them, you say, "Boy, I did this one already. Do this again." You do not have to do them again. I'm not asking for a repeat, a reevaluation, or anything. It's just if you haven't done some of those, please go back and do them. And then again, like I said, there will be additional material on there as well. I'm really going to give you 2 weeks to work on that. It's not going to be due by next Thursday. It'll be due 2 Thursdays from now. So kind of like next week is sort of a free week, catch-up week, whatever. The lab sims can be lengthy, especially the videos, watching through them. Please watch them. Yes, I can watch your time and see if you're actually watching them or not. Well, I can't see. I can see if they're actually playing or not. You watching them, I have no control over. But don't just blow it off. Really watch them, and because it's different perspectives, hearing it again a different way is just going to help give you more insight. Please go through the lab simulations, if they're difficult or struggling through them, just try to work through them. And then, like I said, most importantly, pass the exam questions. Those are going to be a pass-fail. You do not have to get 100% on them, but you do have to pass them. You can redo them as many times as you want. It's not that you get graded on what you get graded on. If you get a 89% or whatever, actually I think you need a 90 to pass, but say you get 95%, you pass. Go back and do it again though until you get 100. What did I get wrong or why or whatever, but that's what you should be looking at. In addition to the lab activities in the book, some of you might be behind, some people have missed a couple of weeks and sort of fallen behind or whatever. This is a good 2 weeks again to be able to get caught up and just fix all that stuff or redo that stuff. We are planning on being through Chapter 6 by 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now, we want to start on Chapter 7 and move forward. Anybody have any questions so far? So again, for next week, these things won't be due for next week. They're going to be due 2 weeks from now to start catching up through Chapter 6. Along with Chapter 6, when we get into that, is dealing with file and print services. The printer section, I'm making optional. If you're behind and really struggling or whatever, don't worry about the printing section. It's really not a huge deal. If you really were put in that situation, you could figure it out or go back to the book and, see how to do it. I want you to much more concentrate on the file permission section of the file and print section chapter. That is what you'll be doing all the time. Printers you set up and they sort of sit there forever. Yes, you will probably need to know that at some point, but again, concentrate on getting caught up through at least the file permissions and the file sharing section, Chapter 6. The printer section also, as long as I'm talking about it, is something that will be most easily done in the classroom because we have a network printer. You can do this at home as well if you have a network printer. If you have a local printer, you can also do it. It's just not going to match the lab at all. So, and again, don't stress over it if you haven't done it. If you do decide to do it in the classroom and you have time and you just want to play with it, the printer information is up on the board here. It's also physically on the printer. So if you really got stuck, you just look on the printer. It needs the printer's IP address, which is 172.16.192.117. That's that printer right there. Oh yeah. Your network printer, it's just a device. So yep, your computer at home is going to have a different IP address as well. And yep, and it's an HP or Hewlett Packard 4100 series. Just sharing that with you. Again, you can walk up to the printer and see the same information. There are a couple, as long as we're talking about details, a couple minor points in the chapter, kind of correction type things, I guess. If you flip your textbook to page 207 in chapter 6, chapter 7, 206, on page 207, you have activity 6-2, working with quotas. Step number two says, open Windows Explorer, navigate to /Windows System 32 directory, and copy the WMPLOC.dll file. And you're using this file because its size is larger than the warning level and smaller than the quota limit. And you're saying, what are those limits? It all is explained in the material, so don't worry about that. The point is that that's based on Windows Vista. In Windows 7, the exact same file exists, but it is actually larger than the quota limit, and so it does not work. So you need to find another file that's above the warning level but lower than the quota level. And so we found one for you in that same directory. And here's a file, spwiz image, spwizimg.dll. But any file, actually, I think it's above 8K and below 10K meg. Let's see, 5 meg. Whatever it's having you before that. But this one file does work for that. So spwizimg.dll. Another very minor point, you could probably figure this one on your own, is on page 211. Page 211. Activity 6-4, it says configuring shadow copies. Configuring shadow copies. Step 8 on page 211, the top half of the page. It says open Windows Explorer, navigate to the shared folder in the queue, data, volume, and then it says right-click the shared folder, which you can all do, and then you click New, But if you left-click on New in the left pane, you only get New Directory. You can't create a new text file. You have to be in the right pane in order to right-click and choose a text and create new text file. So you can still click on the shared folder, but then left-click in the right-hand pane to create a new text document. You're all pretty savvy with that kind of stuff, so you could probably figure out where to create a new text file, but technically that step is incorrect. Going back as far as corrections go, last week we were starting to work with profiles and copying to the default profile. I did talk to the author of the book, and he did admit that it was an issue with Windows 7. It's a very specific Windows 7 thing. He gets around it in class by teaching all of his classes with Vista. It's kind of interesting. Vista 7's been around for a really long time, but it works with Vista. He did share with me the Microsoft approved way of doing this. Not fun at all. Very lengthy, very detailed, way beyond the scope of anything that we're working with in here. He also gave some of the unsupported Microsoft, concepts, and said that they do work for the most part, but just reiterated that they're not supported. So I was debating what to do with that, so I think we're just going to leave it alone for right now. It's not going to affect the rest of our activities. Because I don't want to teach something that's not supported and end up having it bite a corporate infrastructure somehow. So we'll still look at other possible means. But as far as that goes, then in activities 5-7 and 5-8, we'll just kind of ignore those for now and possibly address them in the future. Other questions or comments or anything we've covered so far in any of the chapters? Okay. With that then, I am going to just finish up Chapter 5. We'll talk about that. And what I'll probably do then is just take a break and let you finish up the activities in Chapter 5. Then we'll come back at a designated time. Then I'll talk through Chapter 6 and then give the rest of the day for you to work through Chapter 6. I don't know if many people got done this morning with all those activities, but again, you have 2 weeks to get this done. And ideally, again, I'll have a recording for each of the just individual recordings of the individual labs. As far as we know, they're all working, so I haven't run into any other issues other than just that one file name one. So, okay. Chapter 5, we left off right after Activity 5.8. Let me just switch here. Oh no, 5.9. Just talking a little bit more about groups. We go through groups and then computers and then automated account management in the rest of Chapter 5. So we're sort of jumping around a little bit. Page 182 in Chapter 5, it talks about the default groups in the Windows domain. When an Active Directory domain is created, some default groups are created automatically to establish a framework for assigning users and rights and permissions. And we saw that when we were running our server, that we could actually see a bunch of groups were already created for us, such as on page 183, the account operators group, the administrators group, which we will use quite a bit, the backup operators, the guest group, going all the way down to the users group. And they're there for a purpose so that you can set up some basic rights and basic administration things and right off the bat. So I create a user, they're going to get put into these groups, or I can take them out of groups to do different things. There are also more detailed, I guess, the default groups in the users folder. Those, the ones we looked at so far, were in the built-in folder. Those are built-in groups. But in the users folder, we have other ones, such as allowed RODC password replication group, or the enterprise admins universal group, and just different kinds of groups in there, much more specific. And again, they're there for specific purposes. Apply them as needed. The special identity groups, though, on page 184, are groups, but not really groups. There is no object you can find in Active Directory that's called anonymous login. What it is just that. If you log in anonymously, that would be considered an anonymous login. And so you can't join the group or remove yourself from a group or anything like that. It's just what you are. Like an authenticated user. Either you're logged in or you're not. And if you're logged in, you are an authenticated user. If you're not logged in, you're not an authenticated user. You can give rights by these things, though, and that's what's really nice. So you can basically say everyone, and there's one little distinction here, which we'll talk about. You can say anyone who's logged in is going to be able to do this one thing or these several things. And that's where something like authenticated users. The creator, the owner, the dial-up everyone, interactive network, owner rights, service, system, and then self. The other one that's very similar to authenticated users is everyone. The only difference is the guest account. Authenticated users doesn't count guest as an account. Everyone does. So if you want everyone, including guest, to do something, you use everyone. If you want everyone except guest, then use authenticated users. By default, your guest account is disabled anyway, so you know how often you can be using a guest account. So that's your activity in 5-10 is working with default groups. You sort of get to play around with that. The next section on page 186 is working with computer accounts. Computer accounts are created in the Active Directory when a workstation becomes a member of a domain. Like a user account, a computer account is a security principal with an SID and a password and must authenticate to the domain. Unlike a user account, an administrator can't manage a computer's account's password and so forth. But the main point of there is normally it is when it becomes a member of the domain, the computer account's automatically created. And that's how you get that object in there. And I think that's sort of an easier way of working with it because it just happens automatically and there it is. However, let's see here. When it talks about creating computer accounts, it says it's generally done when they join the domain. Can't find the specific paragraph, but it talks about the other way of managing computer accounts or working with computer, especially creating them, is to create them ahead of time. There it is, top of page 187, right past it. You can also create computer accounts manually before the computer joins the domain. When a computer attempts to join a domain, it automatically uses a computer account matching its computer name, if one exists. Some administrators prefer the manual method so the computer accounts can be created in an OU that already has a group policy linked to it. By doing so, the computer server is subject to group policies immediately on joining the domain, and the administrator doesn't have to move the computer account later on. Okay, so when you create the computer, it's automatically put under the computer's container. Very generic, no group policies applied to it. Well, there's default group policy, but nothing real specific or special. So now that they're there, you create the object. You have to move it after you create it automatically. It's you have to put it into a container that has the right policies that you want, the group policies, such as I don't want them to use any kind of devices. I don't want them to use the USB drives, CD-ROM drives, or whatever. So I have to manage it after it's created. If you go to that container that already has that group policy link to it, and you create the computer, then when that computer joins the domain, it says, hey, the names match. It's automatically put there. And so right off the bat, they're going to have those default or those new group policy restrictions applied to them. I'm not sure, it's personal opinion, I'm sure. As far as adding them, I kind of like the just joining, having them join automatically, have it create the object, and then me going back and moving them. It's one extra step, but moving in an object is a whole lot easier than creating an object, especially because you have to have the computer name specifically mentioned and detailed. If you spell anything wrong, when it joins the domain, it's not going to match, and so forth. So you have to really keep track of all that stuff. Either way, you still have to physically go to the computer and say, join the domain log in with administrator credentials, and then it's able to join the domain. It's just a matter of where it gets put at that point. Don't get confused between user accounts and computer accounts, and about their ability to access the domain. You do not have to be on the domain to access its resources. Right now, this classroom does not log into LTC's domain. However, you can still access their resources. To do that, you just have to log in when you're asking for those resources with the domain credentials. And that's why we do the logins, such as LTC-NT / and then your username, your LTC username, and then your LTC password. So it does not restrict your ability to access the resources. It makes it easier, but not necessary. We've already done that. You should already see the computer there in your Active Directory. So later on when you get into those activities, there isn't a specific activity on there, but go ahead and check it out and see if you can find your computer. The last section in Chapter 5 is dealing with automating the account management. Account management has been discussed mostly from the standpoint of using Active Directory users and computers to work with accounts. When only a few accounts require action, using a GUI tool is convenient. When many accounts require action or certain tasks must be repeated many times, however, a command line program is often the most efficient tool for the job. Now you're going to go through these activities, the rest of the activities in the book, and you say, that's not efficient by any means. Well, it does once you get used to it and you have these batch files saved and these commands, worked out and you're just copying and pasting. Yes, you're going to struggle in this section. Everybody has so far with typing out the lengthy commands. But you should be able to see the value of them, though, in the concept of what you can do with them. So don't get discouraged by them. Be patient. Look through the commands and try to read through them very, very carefully. The biggest mistakes that I've seen so far are typos. You just have the wrong letter. The difference between an equal sign and a dash makes a big difference. Also, the commands, sometimes in the book, it's a little misleading. They'll end the sentence with a period. The command itself does not have a period. Spacing does matter in some instances. Other times you can interchange them, but other times it's very specific. So I wouldn't guess on your behalf. If there's a space in the command, in the book, put a space in. If there's no space, don't put spaces. Like I said, sometimes you can get away with the opposite, and other times you can't. So just sort of follow along with that. One other thing is you're creating a CSV file in Notepad. You're not using Excel to do it, then saving it as CSV. With that, when you save the file, make sure you follow their steps. When you save the file, you have to save it as all files. The default is a text file. And then you end up naming it file.csv.txt. And that's not going to work. So it can't be a text file. And again, you'll be doing a couple imports and exports. Working with batch commands, you have like dsadd, which is adding objects, dsget, displays an object's properties. dsmod, you modify an existing object. dsmove moves the object into a domain to another folder or organizational unit. dsquery, it helps you find objects. And then the things that are met with that criteria, you can then use another command. And one of your commands is a dsquery with a dsmod. So the objects that match this criteria, you are going to modify. And then you have dsrm. rm is just remove, so directory service remove an object. And then they have all the crazy syntax that goes with them. When lost, use /?. Activity 511 is creating a batch file with using dsadd. 512 is using dsquery and dsmod with a pipe. And then finally doing mass imports and exports using CSVDE and an LDIF. CSV is very simple. It's comma separated values. It's basically taking like an Excel spreadsheet, some values, fields, whatever, and you separate them with commas. That's why they call it comma separated values. LDIF, on the other hand, is based on the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Sounds really funky. It is sort of what's lightweight directory access. It's the common way of accessing multiple different types of directories. It's sort of like the go-between, if you want to say that. Many different operating systems have their own directory services. Windows is not unique and wasn't even the first to have a directory service. We have Novell directory services. We have Active Directory, which is directory services. Linux has their own. Unix has some of their own. Lots of directory services out that you can use. LDAP is the way of being able to sort of access and pull things from there and read things back and forth from these different protocols. LDIF is based on that protocol, and with it you're able to then dump stuff into the directory or pull stuff out. In both these examples, you'll be creating users, both using the CSV file, which you'll be typing out. Really careful in that one, and LDIF as well. Even working through these activities, I don't know. I'm just really accustomed personally, I guess, to CSVs. I like the structure of them. They're easy to manage and maintain, and you're going to find the same structure there. LDIF, a little bit different. It's looking for a very structured database format, and so the lines are going to look different and everything. So give it a try. And that's what I have for Chapter 5. Questions on Chapter 5? Yeah, the example of like an LDIF file would look like, and you're going to create this actually, is on page 193. Not easy to manipulate. I mean, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. You just need the sequential line. The CSV file, it's not very obvious. It's on the top of 193, but it's actually a lot easier to work with. Each of the commas are a different field, and it's all one line per record. And what's, like I said, it just lends itself extremely well into Excel, where you have each of the cells being one of those fields. And if you need to copy something, you literally just copy it down all the cells. Or you need something incremental, like user 1, user 2, user 3. You just drag it down, and it will increment it. Or if it doesn't automatically, you can just do some concatenating where it does do it, so you're always going to increment stuff, and it's just very, very nice. Not related to the Active Directory, but we actually did the same thing with these phones and all the accounts on their server. We took one, we set it up manually, and then exported it. And you can do the same thing here. In fact, I even recommend it. It's like if you have no idea what the format looks like, export it and take a look at the file after you created something. Export it and see what it looks like. Then go back in fact, this is what I did. I used Excel. I updated all the accounts on all the different systems, and then I re-imported it, and then it just imports, I don't know, 40 different accounts just like that, as opposed to creating each individual one. And you can see the same thing here. You only create 2 users, and you're going to say, boy, that's a lot of work for 2 users. That's not the point. The point isn't to create those 2 users. The point is to see of how it can be done. And you can just do those 2 users just as easily as you could 1,000 users. It's just get the right format and just do the import. So it's actually pretty slick. Pretty slick. And that's just adding. I mean, that's, you know, we can do so many different things. You can change property settings. Remember all those users that we want to change the, you know, phone number for the fax machine or whatever. You can change anything you want with all those users with just one text file and one command. So, questions, other questions? Okay, continuing on to Chapter 6. We want to just talk through this and then let you go through the labs. This is an important chapter. It talks about a lot of different things that can get pretty confusing when we talk about shares and we talk about NTFS permissions and so on and so forth. The chapter is on Windows File and Print Services, which is the foundational or fundamental purposes of servers. That's why we had the first servers, was to share files and to share printers. On page 202, it says the file system is a critical component of all operating systems. The OS and users must be able to retrieve and store files quickly and securely for the network to function smoothly. File access often goes hand in hand with printer access, which is why these two functions are usually coupled together, called file and print services. The Windows file system. A file system defines the method of format that an operating system uses to store, locate, and retrieve files. And we have different attributes for part of that. The file name conventions, what you can name it, what letters you can use, what letters you can't use, how long it can be. It also talks about whether you can space it or not. They're always hierarchical in structure. Folders can have other folders, which can have other folders, which can have files. How it's stored is based on the file system determines how it's physically stored on the drive, and then what attributes and metadata and what kind of permissions I might be able to provide with it with access control lists. The FAT file system on page 203 consists of a couple of variations, and we're not going to go into all those details. The biggest part with FAT is that it's been around forever, since the original one. And it has a lot of flexibility in that you can interoperate between other operating systems, the Mac operating system, Linux operating systems, Windows, and so on. It's severely limited, though, by its file size, some of its naming conventions, and most of all, by its security. On the bottom page 203, it introduces the NTFS file system. And a couple of things are introduced into that is the disk quotas, the volume mount points, shadow copies, file compression, and encryption, all of things that we'll be covering in class. And of course, the largest aspect is dealing with security in itself. Who can have access to what? And just the complexities of that is just enormous. It's an introduction to it. We go through it. We get to play with a little bit more in other chapters. But this is where it's going to be fundamentally presented to you. So getting an idea of it. Play and practice with it. You have snapshots. You can always go back if you mess things up. But getting the idea of how the permissions work is really important. The first aspect that we talk about on page 204 is disk quotas. With the numbers and types of files used today requiring more space than corporate servers, disk quotas are a welcome tool to help administrators. It talks through there. Please read through these chapters, these sections of the chapter. Hopefully it makes more sense once you get to the labs. So kind of do the labs and then reread those chapters, those sections of the chapter. Like, oh, that's what they mean. We need to enable it, and then you can put thresholds in where warnings are going to be located. And then finally, when you meet the limit, what's going to happen? Are you just going to warn it? Are you going to actually cut it off or whatever? So you can actually say, we have this much disk space, but we're going to limit it to this much area for right now. Gives you lots of flexibility then, because if you just say, hey, anybody can do anything, well, you know, what do you do with any time that you have, you know, extra storage laying around? Yeah, fill it up, right? So I keep things I really don't need or whatever. So you can easily expand it and say, you know what, you really do need it. Go ahead and, you know, we'll increase your quota and give you more space, or, you know, hey, let's see what you really need here and maybe get rid of some stuff. The next couple of chapter activities, page 206 and 207, enabling the quotas and then working with quotas. And again, in activity 6-2, the second step is where we change the file name from wmploc.dll to spwizimg.dll. And it's just because of the criteria that we have set up in Windows 7, the file is actually larger than in Vista. The next section deals with volume mount points. Volume mount points enable you to access a volume as a folder in another volume instead of by using a drive letter. So if I have 3 volumes, each of them is going to have a drive letter. And if I want to share files on them, they'd have, in fact, 3 different shares. The ability to be able to take one whole volume and put it as a mount point under another share just consolidates all that stuff. So all of a sudden it looks like you have more space. It helps you organize stuff potentially of being able to just bring it all together so users have to remember all these different shares. The share is just the way to be able to access all this data. It doesn't change anything with permissions at all. It's just how the user accesses it. And that's activity 6-3, using a volume mount point to put that in there. Shadow copies on bottom page 208. Shadow copies are enabled as entire volume. When this feature is enabled, users can access previous versions of files in shared folders and restore files that have been deleted or corrupted. It does do it on an incremental basis. It does the whole volume at once. So it says, I have a snapshot now, a snapshot now. So it's not as the files are deleted or saved. So it's not revisions that way. It's revisions historically. You know, my third shadow copy or my fourth shadow copy back is the file that I want. It does talk about in this section about that it does take up disk space. If it runs out of disk space, the oldest shadow copies automatically get removed. Even if I do have enough space, it only saves, what is it, 65 of them. It keeps a maximum of 64 previous versions, the 65th. When the 65th is created, then the oldest one is deleted. Going back 65 iterations, though, would be pretty substantial, I think. So now you get to do those activities, configuring shadow copies, and then using shadow copies. You must test your shadow copies configuration. You access the shared folder, the queue data volume from network client, make changes to the text documents you created, and then revert to the saved version. So you actually get to see it in action. Really, really cool feature. Again, just a minor correction, activity 6-4 and step 8. In order to actually create a text document, you have to left click. No. Yeah, you have to click in the right pane. Yeah, you want to click in the right pane so that you can create a new document. Okay. File compression and encryption, they're usually talked about hand in hand. They're completely different things, but you know, even on the page where they show the feature on page 213, they also put them together. Compression is doing like the zipping and unzipping, but on the fly. So you can take a file or a folder and you can compress it, which just means it's going to store it in a smaller space than the hard drive. What it does, it goes through a whole algorithm, figures out what characters need to be represented, and it finds a more efficient, non-standard way of formatting it or using a different coding system to actually store it. The problem with that is that nothing else recognizes it except that file itself, or knowing what the code translates to. So that's why you have to decompress it every time you want to use it. It goes, looks at the code, says this is how it should be translated, and then it pulls it back out and then makes it useful. Completely unrelated is encryption. Encryption is whoever creates the file is the only person that gets to see the file. Now, there's some exceptions to that. The owner can give other people access to it, so then they can see it. And then the administrator has a way of recovering it if necessary, like if the user got deleted or their account is disabled or whatever. So it's kind of fun, kind of cool. You have two activities on that, 6.6 and 6.7. Now we get into kind of the tricky part of this whole thing on page 215, securing access to files with permissions. Well, we work with shares and permissions. There are two modes for accessing files on a network computer. There's network and then interactive, otherwise known as remote or local. If you're accessing it local, if you're right on that machine, all you have is related to is permissions. If I'm accessing it remotely, I have two layers that I'm working with, and that has to do with the shares and then the NTFS permissions. So two different sets of permissions. And this is where it gets really kind of confusing for a lot of people. The best analogy to help keep in mind for me is as if the share is inside a building and the share is inside of a building, and the window to access that is the share permissions. So what am I allowed to see, or what am I allowed to get even into the building? Am I allowed no access? You can't even see anything? Or am I allowed to read it? Am I allowed to write? What can I do with this? And so I have those share permissions. What can I even do to enter that location? Now, that has nothing to do with what you can actually do on the file system itself, and that's the NTFS permissions. That's where we say who can do what. Now, that's where the two really go hand in hand. So if I can say that everybody can do everything with NTFS permissions, let's just say that everyone literally can do everything, but I don't give you any share permissions, you can do anything, you just can't get there. Or if I say that all you can do is read this, it's sort of like limiting your access before you even get there. And so that's where it gets a little confusing, and the more you play with it, the more it's going to make sense and sort of see how it's going to function and operate. Vice versa, I can say, hey, you can fully access the share, but if I don't give you any access to the share itself, well, you can get there, but once you're there, you can't do anything. So there's two aspects. You have to get there, and then once you're there, what can you do? To be honest, that's the most confusing thing that I see about the Windows Server, of having two different sets of permissions that you're always having to deal with, and remembering that, where's that limiting factor, and, what can't I do, or what can I do? Lots of things it talks about in here. What are the NTFS permissions, how they function. We have the right, modify, full control, then we have the special permissions. It talks about the inheritance. Most of the time we think of things functioning at a certain level and then flowing down to the subfolders. We don't always have to do that. We can have it just for this folder only and not have it flow down. And keeping that straight can be confusing. We already played with some of these same kind of exercises that you're going to run into today in the past, where we said don't inherit anymore. We want to remove everybody from the list, or actually we haven't done remove yet. We've done the copy before. Hey, you know what would have been inherited here, I actually want to just not have inherited. I just want to apply it at this level on down, and then you can modify those rights to take new effects. So you're going to be doing that kind of same activities again. Then sort of the extension, so the other half of that, you get to work with sharing, Windows file sharing. A couple ways of doing that. We can do file sharing with a file sharing wizard. Create a test folder, then share it by using the file sharing wizard. 612, probably a little bit more common. I don't know, I like to work with it that way. When I do work with it, sharing a folder with advanced file sharing. Most of the stuff that we've been doing within class so far has been using the advanced file sharing section of the sharing. And then now we're adding on to those features by restricting access to subfolders and then restricting access with deny permissions. So normally you would have all these rights, and now we're going to start denying them or limiting in some respect. It does talk a little bit about some special shares. It talks about, there's the default and administrative shares. They don't have you doing any exercises with that. But you do get into managing shares with the shared folders snap-in. Very cool tool. Lets you see all the shares in one spot, what they are, where they are, and what's sort of going on with them. So a great, great tool. We did an activity like this already, 615, publishing and monitor access to shares. Remember, we published a share, we created a share, and then we published it, and then we had somebody find the published share. You probably don't remember, but you did do it. So maybe as you do it again, it's going to come back and say, oh, yeah. And that's publishing and monitoring a share. Mapping drives. All that mapping drives is our local computers are really designed, at least Windows is designed, to be working with drive letters. I'm saving it to my H drive. I'm saving it to my N drive, my L drive, my K drive, whatever drive I want to save it to. Well, a share doesn't necessarily have a letter assigned to it. It's just a share. So it's going to have the machine name and the share name, and it can be kind of lengthy and kind of hard to navigate sometimes if you're saving a document or a picture or something. So you can assign a drive letter to it. It's a little bit shorter and easier. Now I can go to my L drive, and that's actually going to some share on some server. And mapping a drive works there. it works in Activity 616. The rest of the chapter is just a couple other utilities to help manage your drives. Let's see, what was that? The File Server Resource Manager, Distributed File Systems, using share and storage management, I guess, is the activities. The last part of the chapter, the last two activities deal with printing, installing and sharing a printer, and then accessing that, connecting to a shared printer. And that part, I would hold off on that until you're done with everything else. And if you have time, definitely do that. Excellent, excellent learning things and kind of one of the more important things. But because it is pretty simple and pretty straightforward, and it's one of those things that you don't do very often, though, I'm not going to require it. I'm going to make it optional for you. So if you're behind on other chapters, don't worry about this. This is the thing to sort of do during other free times. These have been really heavy chapters. There are lighter chapters coming. Chapter 7 is not one of them. Chapter 8 should be, which is dealing with Introduction to Windows Networking, which is just working with IP addressing in Windows, which you should be pretty good with. It's going to talk about some couple commands: ping, trace route, NS lookup, but that's about it. So during some of those times, it might be good catch-up times or whatever. We get to DNS. DNS shouldn't be too bad. The functional levels of Active Directory in Chapter 10. Chapter 11 is Certificate Services. Read-only domain controllers. And then finally, Active Directory maintenance. And that shouldn't be too difficult. So, again, for next week, it's just a work week. In fact, it'll be 2 work weeks. So you have all this week and all next week to work on it. So in 2 weeks, you should be caught up through Chapter 6 on your book lab activities. I am putting that list together right now for your lab stems. Many of them you've already done. If you missed some in previous lab activities, learning plans, don't worry about it. Just make sure those, get those done in the next 2 weeks as well. Questions on what we just talked about, though?